Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first Jervis Forum podcast. My name is Joe Parent at the University of Notre Dame. We're lucky to be joined by Marika Landau-Wells from University of California, Berkeley, who's an expert in threat perception. And so we're going to just have a little conversation about threat perception and what we know about it and get onto the frontiers of international security and what we don't know about it and what we're still looking to learn. So, Professor Landau-Wells, thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm so honored to be on your inaugural podcast.
I know. You are by far the best we've ever had. And we would love to know if you could just tell us what threat perception is and what's fascinating about it.
So, when I talk about threat perception, generally people sort of mean one of two things. One is the whole set of processes that goes on in your mind and your brain when something seems dangerous in the world, and you think, "Oh my goodness, something's going to hurt me in some way." That whole process, from the information hitting your eyeballs to filtering through your brain to the "Oh my God" moment when you realize something out in the world is dangerous, that is one kind of threat perception. There's another kind which is like, "Joe, I am going to take your stuff." That's a sort of directed threat from another person. It's a different kind of mental process. There's still stuff going on. You hear my words, you realize that something's upsetting or troubling to you, but it's very much a sort of social process that I'm threatening you. And we see both kinds of things in the world, and I'm interested in both. But the first one, that sort of danger perception, just looking out in the world and all of a sudden feeling like something or someone is going to be dangerous to me, that's the focus of what I study. And
Awesome.
I can just say that, I think it's important because our brains are doing this all the time. We have this sort of background system running that's, helping us be safe, be careful, but it does a lot more than that when it comes to our behavior. And I think that it's one of the most important kinds of behaviors that humans engage in is trying to make themselves feel safe. And so the more we understand about that, the more we understand about what people are doing in the world around us.
Sweet. Can you give us some specific examples from international politics of how threat perception aggregates up in public opinion and affects policy?
Sure. I mean, there are basically any number of headlines that you could pull out today and say, hey, this is an example of threat perception at work. We know from a lot of the documentation around the conflict in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, that there are sort of dueling perceptions of who was more dangerous to whom at the outset of that conflict. But certainly in the sort of long history of international relations and great power politics, the story has been the story of how dangerous are, my rivals to me. The Cold War is a great exercise in sort of watching threat perception develop and change over time. The Soviet Union and the United States were not always, always, always rivals. And that rivalry changed, and the danger that was seen by one side from the other changed over time. And that, in many ways, shaped what we call the Cold War. And that's actually where I kind of got started, was one of the instances of threat perception that I was super drawn to was the perception of communism by Cold War policymakers. I just found all the language that they used, the way that they conceived of the threat of this sort of set of ideas to be fascinating and also very consequential for everything that happened next.
So, for people who are more familiar with domestic politics, can you talk about how international politics and the threats in international politics can sometimes create enemies within? Why sometimes that's higher and sometimes that's lower?
Sure. I think, well, the Cold War is a great example of that, and I can also talk about more contemporary ones. But one of the things that people sort of maybe ignore a little bit in the study of international relations is how much communism was perceived to be an internal threat. And if we think about things that, maybe people have heard of, like the McCarthy hearings, McCarthyism, the House Un-American Activities Committee, the surveillance that was done by the FBI of citizens of the United States going about their business, all in the name of rooting out this terrible idea, this set of beliefs, that brings an international battle. So this sort of war of ideas between communism and democracy, or at least that's what it was seen to be by the people who were in charge of making foreign policy. They also understood that there was a domestic component to that. One of the most famous scholars or famous writers on this is George Kennan. So he's the author of The Long Telegram and also the author of Containment in many ways, the early Cold War strategy. But Kennan knew that like there were potential sort of weaknesses at home that could be exploited by an international power, an enemy, and that the threat from within could potentially be quite worrisome. Not because he thought that everybody was going to become communist, but he thought that maybe if we didn't make our society great enough, that other ideas would look pleasing.
So, in terms of modern parallels, what do you see?
I mean, I think that we have a lot of the sort of same patterns, unfortunately, kind of repeating themselves. When we look around and think about sort of competition between ideologies, I think people throw around language like socialism and communism now, not necessarily understanding what those ideologies are, but using ideology as an excuse in order to kind of create a conflict domestically that maybe doesn't necessarily hold a lot of water. We also see it with things like immigration policy. So, one of the sort of great, I think, kind of areas where international relations becomes domestic politics is in immigration policy, right? This is talking about the exchange of people from outside and having them come in and what that does. And I guess probably after the Cold War, the next thing that I moved on to study when I studied threat perception was immigrants, perceptions of threats posed by immigrants from different places, and what that meant for the policies that people wanted. At the time, I was really interested in this idea of a border wall and how people really gravitated towards that as a potential solution to a problem that they perceived, despite, a lot of commentary saying like, hey, this isn't gonna work. Like, this fortification is not going to do the thing you want it to do. And I just find it fascinating, the things that people want that they think will make them feel safe versus what, the real world is going to give them in exchange for that idea. And I think that mismatch is incredibly important when it comes to threat perception and why it matters. The things that we perceive drive what we want, but the real world is like an arbiter of what we can actually have. And so we might want a wall, we might want a physical defensive fortification between us and someone else. But if the reality is that that's not going to actually protect you anymore from that or any other ill for lots of reasons, then why spend the billions to build the thing that's not going to work?
Well, it's super relevant and widely applicable. How do you pick topics given that problem?
Well, the lucky thing when you study something like threat perception is that it's kind of everywhere, and it's everywhere because our brains come prepared to learn about danger. I would not say that we're hardwired for any particular kind of threat over any other. I'll happily debate that with anybody, but I think we are prepared to learn about danger, and we learn and see danger in lots of places. I don't love spiders. That, might make me a little bit spider phobic, might shape my behavior, not a huge problem. But we can see danger in lots of things that actually aren't really going to hurt us, which means I can look all over the place to see threat perception. Where I choose to look is where I think it has the most impact. So one of the things the project that I'm working on right now looks at national security strategies and how it is that people who are making choices on behalf of countries, not just the United States, choose to deploy their resources to achieve security, to feel safer. And I pick those because those are huge outlays of resources, not just money, but people's time, that could go to a host of other things, but they don't. They go to this ideal of trying to make their people feel safer, be safer to some extent. And so I sort of gravitate toward these high cost threat perception problems because I think that it's not that they're more worth explaining than my spider aversion, but possibly it's a little more important to more people. And I think that's an interesting space to work in.
All right, if we could ask you the impossible to give us a ridiculously shortened trajectory of the field of threat perception, could you give us the history of the study of threat perception in 2 to 4 minutes?
Sure. So one of the great things about being on this podcast and the fact that it's named after the Jervis Forum is that Bob Jervis was one of the initial sort of folks in IR to point out systematically that threat perception was really, really important. And he did that in a couple of ways, by saying not only, is it that states see one another as threatening, and we can go back to Thucydides and we can make that sort of go way, way, way back with that argument. But Jervis said, like, no, it's the pictures in people's heads. It's what's in decision makers' minds. It's the difference between that perception and reality. That's what really makes threat perception so consequential. And so Bob sort of planted that flag in Perception and Misperception in International Politics, which I read cover to cover as a grad student. And then folks tried to follow on, I think, with that work, trying to understand the psychology of threat perception. Folks like Janice Gross-Stein, who've put together a huge body of work on the subject. But I think people got a little bit stuck because it turns out that studying the things in people's heads is actually really hard. And it's really hard if you're going to study leaders and decision makers who you don't have access to. And so the field, I think, as a whole got to the point of like, threat perception matters. It must matter. But how would we know if a particular theory of threat perception was good or bad, right or wrong? And I think maybe we stalled a little bit there. Folks had, interest in things like the security dilemma, which hinges on threat perception, and could make progress in those spaces. But what was sort of missing was a big theory of threat perception and how it might link systematically to behavior, which is the thing that I'm working on now. And to do that and to try to like pull the field forward a bit, I've done a lot of work using brain data. So as I mentioned, threat perception is a process that happens in your brain. And your brain gives rise to your mind. And so I think if we understand the process as it happens in the brain and how it sort of manifests in the mind, and we do that systematically, not just sort of our intuition saying, hey, I think like this, but actually asking, what kind of data can we bring to the table about how the brain processes danger? I think from there we can build a social science of threat perception that helps us even understand things at the international level. Because ultimately, still people in a room making choices, talking to each other, and they've got brains too. And thanks to a sort of long, long, long evolutionary arc, their brains and our brains are similar in a lot of respects. And so I think we can use that to then push the study of threat perception forward.
Okay, so where do you think are the most exciting places now on the frontiers of threat perception?
I think that there are a few areas where I've seen cool contributions recently. One is to look at language. So language use and choice. As you know, we're living in a world where language and ways in which to sort of model it analytically and capture it numerically are, springing up new ones every day. I don't think all those tools are great, but some of them are. And the systematic analysis of language and word choice, I think, really matters when it comes to threat perception. There's a lot of dismissal in IR of cheap talk, but I think around threats, it pays to look at what people say. If somebody describes somebody else as a cockroach, you should pay attention to that. That's not just cheap talk. That's an entire mapped on way of thinking about that person that might explain what happens next. And so because we can now use computational tools, digitization of archival documents, all that stuff to really understand the words that people have used to talk about threats, that offers, I think, a way of moving beyond, not that single case studies are bad, but just sort of doing a large scale sort of examination of how people talk about threats and what that says about their behavior that we could never have done in the past. And so I'm really excited about that. I also think that the work on the brain could be better. There could be more of it. It's a very expensive way of doing things in time and money. So I'd say I'm very excited about that, although I recognize that it's quite niche and not as many people will have access to it. But I think that ultimately thinking about threat perception as a systematic process and not just as, hey, this is where noise and uncertainty meet the real world and, misperceptions are just mistakes. I think we can all move beyond that and start to look at threat perception as a systematic thing and not just as the error term in our explanation of policy making and decisions.
All right, that sounds both exciting and promising. Professor Landau-Wells, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for having
It
me.
was an honor to have you. But tune in next time where we're going to do more on the frontiers of international security with the Jervis Forum. Thank you for joining us.